This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome everyone to today's Economy, Culture and Skills Committee meeting. Thank you all for joining us as we discuss the declining number of children in London. Today we will explore trends in birth rates and child population, focusing on the differences between inner and outer areas of London. We aim to understand why these rates are declining, their economic implications and what it means for public services. We will also discuss whether the Mayor, along with local and central government, should take action to address these challenges. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to please switch their mobile phones to silent mode. I also ask that members and guests position their electronic devices away from the microphones. Please adjust your microphones so you can be heard clearly, and remember to lift them from the base if needed. Members of the public are encouraged to follow at London Assembly on various social media platforms. When using X, please use the hashtag AssemblyEconomy. And now I have a few items for business to cover. Now, can I ask our committee clerk, Sal Fazal, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies have been received.
And can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out on item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of September 2025 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings and the additional correspondence received? Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by me as chair under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the committee's report, Universal Basic Income in London, a review, as attached as Appendix 1 on agenda report. Noted. Yep. Yeah, that was a very loud noted from one member. Can I ask the committee to note the responses received from the Mayor of London to the committee's outputs as set out in the agenda report? Thank you. We're now going to move on to our main item of business, a discussion on the committee's investigation into the declining number of children in London. I'd like to welcome our guests for today's session. In the chamber, we have Susie Dye from Grants Manager, Trust for London, Catherine Hill, Strategic Programme Manager for IN10, and Dr. Bernice Kwong from the Research Fellow in Demography, University of Southampton. Thank you. Welcome. I'll be asking the very first question. The concerns have been expressed that London could become a child-free city. Are these concerns justified? We can start with Susie and then go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So the data does show, there are still nearly 2 million children in the capital, but certainly we have seen rapid drops in the numbers of younger children aged 0 to 10 in the city. And this does seem to be linked to both rapid changes in terms of the income profile of parts of the city and related to high costs of living here in London.
And Catherine, we'll go to you, and Bernice, we'll be asking you a different questions, if that's okay. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the committee. I think the first thing I'd say is that to some extent these issues aren't new. People have often, for long periods of time, have left the city to the leafier suburbs, perhaps to raise children. But I think the question for us all now is whether that is a matter of choice or whether people are feeling that they're being forced to leave, possibly where they would have preferred to stay and where they and their family may have lived for generations. As Susie's mentioned, Trust for London's work on gentrification has shown that families and those on low incomes are rapidly being priced out of areas where until recently they have been able to live and raise their children. And in large part that is to do, we believe, with the availability of social housing. So yes, I would say that the concerns are justified, but they are perhaps a little bit more complex than the headline would suggest. So I think there are different scenarios. There are scenarios of a child-free London. There are also scenarios where there are only children of very wealthy families able to live in London, or a third scenario perhaps where we've got a London with children in it still, but with even vaster sort of levels of inequality between them. And I guess the related question, which is not the one who asked, but is whether this matters. And I suppose we would say, as a children's rights organisation, yes, it does matter. You know, the former mayor of Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa, has spoken memorably about children as being an indicator species. And where children thrive, everyone else can thrive too. And where that isn't true, where children are absent from our communities, that's a sign of an unhealthy, unthriving city. And that's something I would very much hold to. So we would also say that a city should want to nurture and support its children and young people so that they will grow up here and they will want to stay and contribute both socially and to the economic development of the city as well. London rightly prides itself on being a very diverse city, and we would say that diversity should cut across all parameters and including age, and London ought to be a city where you can thrive from, you know, cradle to grave. And finally, I say it matters, and the question is justified, because we need to be aware that the declining child population will have an impact on the way our city feels, and potentially change it irreparably. So, for example, I was looking at some of the school closures, and the Clerkenwell Church of England parochial school, which shut its doors in 2021, had been there for 321 years, had been believed to be the oldest state school building in continuous use in London before its closure, and now it's sitting empty. These schools have been at the heart of our local communities, and they represent far more than bricks and mortar. They're places where people come together to learn, to socialise and to support one another, and they're very much the heart of our communities. If we lose them, you know, we're losing a lot more than just figures on a graph.
I'm really pleased that you did raise that question of whether it matters. I think that was a really valid question. So to Susie and Catherine, the data suggests that the demographic change is most pronounced in inner London. Is this just an inner London issue, or is it impacting the whole of the city? Do you want to go first, Susie?
Sure. And, Chair, if I can just elaborate a little bit on something that Catherine mentioned there. So Trust for London, through London's poverty profile, has run some data on areas that were low income in 2012 and have seen big changes in income over time. We've labelled these 53 areas gentrified areas, and these are some of the areas that have had some of the biggest changes in terms of drops of numbers of children 15 and under. One thing that you note is that of those 53 areas, yes, 2/3 are inner London, but 1/3 are outer London. So it's not just inner London, while some of those changes may be more pronounced in those areas.
And just to add very much in the same vein, you may have been alerted there's some research recently carried out by the Education Policy Institute looking at primary school closures. And that found that 9 out of the 10 local authorities who recorded the largest declines in primary school pupil numbers were in London, the largest being Westminster, and then the next 8 areas were also in London. With 8 to 14% drops. So in order from Lambeth, Southwark, Hackney, Camden, Hammersmith and Fulham, Islington, Merton and Wandsworth. And you'll note that, yeah, out of those, 8 out of the 9 are inner London boroughs, but with the exception of Merton there. So I think yes, it's very true of inner London. I think as you said, the picture in outer London feels much more mixed. So there have been areas like Merton where there have been significant drop-offs in primary school pupil numbers, but then others, so Havering being the most obvious example, there was an increase of 4% in demand for primary school places over the 5-year period that the EPI looked at. So I think. Yeah, I think I would say it was mixed in outer London and pretty acute problem in inner London.
So you're saying that there is a trend that is moving, that it's following inner London statistic.
Potentially, although in some areas that trend appears to be being bucked. So whether that's about people moving from inner to outer London, who may then subsequently, you know, we may be looking at a position where they, you know, as outer London perhaps becomes more expensive to live in, people are then displaced further outside the city. Or possibly not. You know, I think in this area there are a lot of question marks still where we don't necessarily have all the data. So we can observe the trends, but we can't necessarily explain them.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there really a member Clark? Thank you. Bernice, I'll be coming to you. What are the main reasons for national decline in fertility rates?
So the UK is not alone in its fertility decline. We've seen across the Western world and across Europe that there's been fertility decline in countries where, we would have normally thought of them as higher fertility countries. Probably one of the biggest things to attribute fertility decline to is the postponement of fertility. So fertility is measured in all different ways, but usually the headline measure that is used is the total fertility rate. And this rate is it's kind of a theoretical number because it describes what today's age-specific fertility rates are and what the average number of children a woman would have if she went through her life course ascribing to today's fertility rates. But of course, no one person can be age 20 in 2025, age 30 in 2025, and age 40 in 2025. So it's kind of a theoretical measure that then is vulnerable to shocks and things like postponement. So, across the Western world, fertility has been postponed, which essentially means people wait longer now to have their first child. I think in London, the average age of first birth is 32. So this will cause, when I talk to my undergrads, I ask, do you think that's old? And they say, no, that sounds perfectly reasonable. So, it's not an age that's perceived as particularly old, but what it does is that it causes a decline in the measured total fertility rate, which may rebound later if people postpone and then catch up to however many children they want to have in the future. So postponement has led us to see a decline for now in fertility that may rebound a little bit as young people today eventually start their families. It may not if young people postpone and then either decide they don't want to have the 2 children, that's very, very average in the UK, or they run out of time. So postponement is often linked to longer time spent in education. That's very robustly linked to postponement, which most people think is a good thing, right, if people spend more time in education. The longer transition to adulthood, so it takes longer now to establish yourself in your career, to buy a house, to leave the parental home. And then also to globalization of the labor force and economic precarity. So when people aren't so sure about their financial futures, they will also, be reluctant to start a family. And then lastly, it's also related to ideational change about priorities people have for what they would like to do before they start a family, if they want to start a family, like travel, leisure, time alone with your partner. If you're already partnered, you might wait longer. So those are things that are pretty robustly linked to fertility decline in most high-income contexts.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you. So you obviously mentioned postponement, but in London, we seem to have more women who wait longer to have children than the rest of the country. Is it the reasons you stated are more acute in London than they are in the rest of the country, such as globalization and higher education, or are there other factors that are happening in London more so than the rest of the country?
So it's difficult to do subnational analysis with large-scale data because most survey data that have the information that would allow us to do this don't have large enough sample sizes. So that's always my academic disclaimer. But, one could imagine that the population in London is very unique, even compared to other urban areas in the UK. So it's got a lot of migrants, and migrants are working age people who seem like they're parent age, but they might not be planning to settle here and have a family. And in recent years, it's been very difficult for a migrant to settle down and start a family. I say this as a migrant who has settled down here and started a family. It's not the easiest of circumstances. And in that way, I think London is unique from other urban areas. Housing is extremely expensive. And we know that culturally in the UK, it's seen as necessary to own a house before you start a family. To either own a house or have stable social housing, it's usually not seen as private rented accommodation is usually not seen as the context for starting a family, although that is changing. So I think that's unique to London as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So
You made a really interesting point in that you can't be 20, 30, and 40 all at the same time when we're looking at this data. But do you expect the decline in fertility rates in London and nationally to continue to fall? I mean, is there any sort of indication that the trend won't continue or that something may change?
I suspect as a researcher, but again, we don't have the granular data, that what's going on in London is probably more compositional than changes in behavior, just because the population of London is compositionally so unique, in addition to the very expensive housing and the difficult circumstances with third space. I think it's probably more compositional than we would think, because in any place, larger settlements have lower fertility than smaller settlements. And a lot of that change is due to differences in that first birth. So if you don't even have your first birth in the city, then your second or third birth, like none of those children will then contribute to the child population in London. And also because of the composition of labor, people who come to London for 3 years, 4 years to work and then leave with no intention of having a family. That may be that's again a compositional change that may be exacerbated by it being increasingly difficult to stay in the UK due to migration law, and then also the student population as well. That there's probably some global changes in that as well. So I think while the composition of London is different, the people who make up this different population are also changing over time as national circumstances change as well. So that was a lot of ideas.
It really does make sense. And when we look at fertility graphs, as we did earlier this morning, just looking at fertility graphs of different waves of migration and, times when my babies were born in the early 2000s, there was lots of babies being born, and that has slowed down. But also, the composition of inner and outer London changed in that time as well. You're talking about compositionally different, and we have inner London and outer London, both of which fertility is declining, but more acutely in inner London. Would you attribute that to inner London being just different demographics than outer London?
I mean, I imagine it's more expensive. Yeah. I imagine housing is at a greater premium. Most people in the UK have 2 or 3 children, so fertility decline, especially in recent years, is because people are waiting longer to have that first child. Once they do have that first child, most of them go on to have 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. So that's very robust. Fertility is declining in the UK, but if you look at the average family size, there's still a lot of 2 to 3 child families. That's still by far the preferred family size in the UK. And you look at survey data, everybody says they want 2 children. So in that way, that's very stable. And I imagine, you could maybe have 1 child in a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom flat or apartment, but to have your second or third, it's probably really difficult in the most expensive areas.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. And thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We're going to move on to domestic and international migration with Assembly Member Blansky.
Thank you, Chair. Susie, if I can begin with you. Obviously, we're just talking about fertility rates there. Moving, though, to exactly that, domestic and international migration, what role does people moving out of London play in this?
Am I allowed to defer to the demographer on the details?
Yeah,
I'm so sorry. I've got much more information on costs and things like that. Then
that's okay, no problem. I'll come back to you. Catherine, can I throw the same question at you? And again, feel free to refer to it.
I'll give you a moment. I'm not a demographer either, and I'm not particularly a stats person, but I think we can say certain things. We are very focused on those cost elements and what would be driving people to sort of migrate from London, I suppose. I came across a really interesting graph, which I can share with the committee, put together by a consultancy called PRD, who looked at how much money it would cost a key worker household, so a social worker, a teacher with a toddler would need to live in London. And they crunched a lot of data. I don't know exactly how, but they came to the conclusion that there were only 4 boroughs in London, so Hillingdon, Havering, Sutton and Croydon, where you would have any money left over at the end of the month to be able to afford to live. And the figures for sort of living in central London Southwark, you'd be down £663 a month. So it's very clear, you know, and we say this is an anti-poverty charity, that people simply cannot afford to bring up their children in these boroughs. You know, the numbers simply don't add up. So they're faced with the choice of not having any children or moving out to have them. And I think we can kind of clearly see that, and the EPI research that I referred to earlier, you know, has shown that the number of they looked at the number of people in reception year and then looked at them again at year 6, both in 2013, I think it was, and then 2017-18. And in the earlier period, there was a 17% movement of children of primary school age out of London, and by the later date, which is still now quite a few years old, that had risen to 20%. So we are seeing that kind of exodus, really, of people with children, and there's kind of clear data for that alongside the data around fertility rates as well. So there is clear that migration is having an impact. In terms of international migration, I mean, I guess I think, you know, you will be well aware that the data around international migration to the city is not clear and quite difficult. But we know that we have very recently, sort of 22-23, been through a period of very high migration that has fallen back in 2024. Somewhere between 1.2 and 1.3 million people entering the UK, about a third of those residing in London. So we knew that there has been significant migration. We know that it's not equally distributed around London. There are certain boroughs, Newham and Tower Hamlets, very much receiving the vast majority of migrants. So I did do some looking at the situation in one of those boroughs. So I looked at Tower Hamlets, and I looked at some of the data that the council had provided to their cabinet about school roll data in Tower Hamlets, expecting to see that very significant immigration numbers having an impact on primary school places. And the interesting thing is that it doesn't have a particularly different pattern to other parts of London. Although the population in the borough grew by approximately 24% between 2012 and 23, in the 0 to 4 age group, there was a 7% decrease. So, you know, even with that sort of very large inward migration, a lot of it international, still the number of children seems to be on the decline. And then they were looking at their primary school places, obviously, and the demand for primary school places they said had fallen by 10% in the 10-year period from 2013. And they were attributing that both to declining fertility rates and pupils moving out of the borough, very similar to other boroughs we looked at where there were much lower levels of international migration. So I'm not sure what that tells us, you know, other than a kind of anecdotal way. But I think it's far from clear that's having a very significant impact.
That's really helpful. Bernice, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but Catherine, if I can stick with you, to what extent did the pandemic play a role in families moving out of London?
I wouldn't have the data to have, but I believe it did have a significant impact. It also had an impact on the number of children who might be missing from schools as well, right, who left, who we don't know that they necessarily left London, but they didn't come back to school necessarily. So there are, you know, we mustn't forget that group of children as well. Potentially there are some missing, you know, they're known as sort of missing children as well from the data. I think there you can always see that kind of blip in the graphs, but I think that the trends in terms of fertility and the economic pressures that are causing migration from the city are on a much more sort of long-term trend.
Thank you. Bernice, if you can clear all of this up for us.
Sure. We do know from large-scale national-level data that migrant fertility differs from non-migrant fertility in the first birth. So it may seem like migrants have higher fertility than non-migrants, but we've recently published a paper that showed that they actually don't. When you disaggregate it by birth order, which is really important for understanding the decision to have children, migrants actually have a lower first birth rate than non-migrants. So that means they're less likely to start a family. But then once they do start a family, once you're only looking at those who have started a family, you're only looking at parents, they're more just as likely to go on to a second birth and more likely to go on to a third because a lot of them have larger families. So in that way, it kind of makes sense that in a place where there are a lot of there's a large migrant population. If they're not the type to start a family, then then that's zero, right? Like if you look at step by step what the conditional probabilities are across time. And I think it's so interesting that I think you said it was £600 a month for childcare, or £600 left over after.
Minus £600.
Okay, maybe I misheard, but I would like to know where childcare is £600 a month. So it's much more expensive in London to have childcare than anywhere else in the country, and we also know from studies of family policies that different family policies work better for different population subgroups. So affordable childcare is important for everybody, but people tend to think that, if you have good parental leave, then that's going to encourage people to have children. And that's true for some social groups that have a really strong tie to the labor force, but it's less true for lower income people who have more tenuous ties to the labor force. I think that's what I wrote down that I wanted to say.
That's really
helps.
Helpful. Susie, just to say, I really want to hear about affordability, but another colleague's going to ask, so that's the only reason why I've not dug further. Thanks, Chair.
Assembly Member Georgie.
I'm conscious, Chair, that I was going to just ask a question on Benita's point about childcare. I don't know if you want me to bring that in later under Councillor Armand's questions. I'm happy to do it now. Yeah, OK. Benita, I think the point that you raised on sort of the aggregation of childcare is an interesting one. So, for example, the reason, and I think, Catherine, you hit on this as well, is I think part of the problem is that it depends on how many days a week your kid's in school, right, in nursery. So, for example, at one point I was paying £800 a month for my daughter's nursery fees, and it was the standard rate for where I live, but that was for 2 days a week. So I guess my question is, I appreciate it's very complicated to collate that sort of data and an average of how many times a week kids are actually in nurseries in London. But do you think there's a way of trying to figure that out to really work out the true cost? I know you've said 600 is the average cost, but how does that work out across London?
The cost, the previous figure was related to kind of aggregate family household costs. So, but in terms of childcare costs, I mean, we've got quite a lot of data about just how expensive it is in London, certainly relative to other parts of the country. So we know that it's 62% higher in inner London, for example, at £319 a week, when you've compared to the East Midlands, where it's only 197. So it's very clear that the costs in London are extremely high, and lots of people talk in terms of having a second, equaling a second mortgage or those sort of figures. I think a lot of this is about how it interacts with the government's entitlements and the sort of 30 hours a week funded offer that's being given to working parents. We did some research about 18 months ago now, which looked at this and how it worked, particularly for families on low incomes, and that 30 hours doesn't go very far when, because it's only 30 hours for, term time only. So when you spread it over the rest of the year, it doesn't even add up to 30 hours a week. And for most working parents, that's not the hours that they work, so they are left with a very significant shortfall they need to make up, and that's where these very significant costs come in.
I think just one final question on this, just very briefly. Do your calculations bake in the assistance that the government provides for those under £100,000 a year, or does it not bake it in?
No, I think that is.
It does bake it in. Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
We were going to be talking about childcare a little bit further. Yeah, but I think you want to come in with your additional question. And
very briefly, Catherine again, although if anyone wants to come in. So Zohran Mamdani, the hopefully next Mayor of New York, has been talking about universal free childcare. And I'm just wondering if your organisation or any organisations you know have been looking at this at all.
Yes. We would certainly advocate. I mean, I think as a step towards having a universal childcare offer very much akin to the way that we offer free education from age 5 up, we would want that to come down and include early years education as well. But on a step towards that, we would certainly want to see it decoupled from whether your family are in work and from migration status as a first call, because I think, we do believe that it's a universal good, both for an individual and for the city and for society, and on that basis it ought to be freely available.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, brilliant. There may be another question on childcare coming up, but we'll see where we go. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. So my question is, I'm going to leave it to you to see who's best fixed to answer this. So we've obviously touched on housing, but what I'd like to do is ask you specifically about housing costs on the ability of people to raise children in London, and to address the issue as to whether it impacts people on lower incomes or those on middle incomes as well. So, Bernice, would you like to start with that?
Sure. So the transition to first birth in social housing is, at least at the national level, pretty robust. So I think it may be people in the middle who, don't have access to social housing, but who are also not affluent enough to, just move into a 3-bedroom house when the time comes, who are left without the support. And people who don't have other kinds of social support, but are, because they make a little bit too much money, but then not enough to really go very far in London. Sorry, I'm sure everyone has a lot to say about childcare, but I forgot to mention on the question of migration is that migrants don't have access to a lot of benefits, including the subsidized 30 hours of childcare. That's changed, but in the last few decades, that if you have a Tier 4 visa, it says on your resident card you do not have recourse to any public funds, and that includes even child benefit, tax-deductible childcare, and the funded hours.
Thank you. Susie.
I am Trust for London's housing lead, so this is my area. So housing costs, as I'm sure people know, is a big driver of poverty in London. So once housing costs are taken into account, there are around 1 million extra people living in poverty in London. And Inner London has some of the country's highest housing costs, with rent up to 80% of an individual average income. There's been a big shift in tenure in housing. So in London in particular, big declines in social housing and big rises in private renting. And this is especially clear in these 53 gentrified areas that we looked at. Remember, these were areas that were low-income areas. They experienced a 5.2 percentage point drop in local authority social renting and a 5.9 percentage point increase in private renting. So you've just got a shift in terms of the affordability of those homes and who's likely to be able to afford to live there. That has an effect, right? If you can't find somewhere stable and affordable to make a home and bring up a family, then either you delay that or you move away. People don't want their children to grow up in poverty. So I think that does make a big difference.
Can I just ask you then, Susie, do you think the issue of fewer family-sized homes impacts these decisions as well?
Short answer, yes. We hear from some of our stakeholders that, I'm thinking about some of the by and for community groups that we've been funding for advice work, and they really struggle with overcrowding, with not being able to either get or afford a family-sized home. We also see, I think, in some of the housing data that even where family-sized properties are being built, they are actually being used by sharers, by young professional sharers. And again, our gentrification data shows that in these areas you've got a shift away from traditionally working class occupation groups and more towards sort of higher professional groups as well.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Catherine?
Just really briefly, I think that assumption about social housing being available is the one that's sort of most questionable in this, I think, because I think the recent work that Trust for London funded from Loughborough University on the minimum income standard has for the first time not assumed that people will have access to social housing and that social rent will be sort of a possibility for people as a matter of right, which is quite a shift in that methodology and shows that over 50% of children in London are now living in households that don't reach that minimum income standard threshold. So I think it is having impacts on both middle income earners and low earners. They're different impacts, but they are both there. And again, to the point on overcrowding, possibly for those on the lowest incomes, there may not be the opportunity to relocate, but so what happens instead is that those homes become very overcrowded. I think some work that Queen Mary University did found that looking at the boroughs in North East London found that almost half of families, 46%, of families were living in overcrowded homes. So I think that's what it looks like in that demographic. In another demographic, it might look different, but the pressures are the same.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Assembly Member Desai, do you have anything?
Yeah. So it's a slightly different question, Chair, because the question I was going to ask you has already been asked by other members. But can I come at it from this angle? Assemblymember Polanski has referenced Mamdani's pledge around childcare in the context of the New York governor, race to be governor. But we already have an initiative in this country. On the 1st of September, the government pledged to fund childcare for 30 hours a week, saving parents some £7,500 a year per child, and putting more money in their pockets. This will also boost economic growth. So can I ask the panel, what are your thoughts on this particular initiative? What more can the government be doing? What can the state at all levels be doing to address the pressing issue of the cost of childcare?
Thank you for the question. I think it would be careless not to acknowledge the fact the government has invested very heavily in childcare and has committed to the entitlements that the previous government put in train. So I think that's really very welcome. I think our concern is that it's not going to the right places, that money, because of the way the offer is currently structured around the 30 hours and the historic underfunding of that offer. So if I was a childcare provider sitting here in front of you, I'd be telling you very much that the hourly rate that the government's providing for those funded hours isn't, particularly in London, is not meeting the cost of providing it, which means that there are additional fees that people have to pay, and it becomes very quickly very unaffordable to a lot of people, despite the generosity of the offer. So I think the current government has committed to reviewing the funding, which I think is very welcome, and we hope very much so that a revised funding offer, because there's the 30-hour entitlement that you refer to, but there's also the childcare element of universal credit. There's the offer to disadvantaged 2-year-olds. So there's quite a patchwork of funding at the moment, and I think we feel that considerable investment could be much better spent and particularly directed to the most disadvantaged children. I think the other thing that in this context of this inquiry that would be really useful for the committee to think about is this issue of childcare deserts. And because of the difficulties and the pressures on providers in terms of providing this offer and other childcare, there has been some research from the University of Victoria in Australia has looked at childcare availability across Europe, and it covers England and London, and has identified this problem of childcare deserts and parts of the city where it's increasingly, even if you've got the entitlement to find a place, isn't actually becoming as big a problem as affordability. So I think that, particularly if the demographics are telling us that in certain areas the child population is declining, the incentive for providers to kind of be going into those areas and providing affordable childcare is perhaps less. So I think that's something that in the context of this inquiry is really pressing concern.
Thank you. Catherine said a lot of what I had planned to say, but I would just add that in addition to the supply issue, which is the childcare providers, they don't get reimbursed at a high enough rate. So what do they do to offset the shortfall? They charge more to the parents of of children who don't quite qualify for it. So parents of infants pay extremely high rates to subsidize the shortfall from the government reimbursement. And if in that first year you're paying so much for childcare, do you want to stay in the city? Maybe not. And then in addition to that, the childcare sector has really been taken over by a lot of private childcare companies, which you'd say, like, okay, well, what's wrong with that? Well, those companies, they're not beholden to the same standards to address or to meet the needs of children with special needs and additional children with disabilities, but public childcare facilities are required to. And if they then get all of the kids with special needs, then they often don't have the resources to meet those needs. So I would imagine it's difficult to, to find services if you're a parent with a child who has special needs.
Just briefly to add, a long time ago I worked at the Bromley by Bow Centre, which had a Sure Start Children's Centre. And it's been a long time, but certainly that was in an area where some of the mums didn't necessarily trust their children into childcare, but that trusted community, connected, and high quality place in the community was somewhere where they did trust it, and it did make a difference.
Yeah, I am aware of the work of the centre. We've been there quite often. So do initiatives like breakfast clubs and free school meals, particularly for primary school children, would that help as well? I know there's some people in this chamber who probably would say that there's no such thing as a free school meal, but I was a Newham councillor when we pioneered the country's first free school meals programme in 2009, along with two other authorities, and the link between, the boost that it gave to hard-pressed families in terms of, making sure that the child had one healthy meal a day, but also the links with educational achievement. So I think overall, as a package, this particular initiative by the government, which in principle I think you all welcome, although there are flaws in how it's implemented, but along with measures such as breakfast clubs and free school meals, what are your views?
Yeah, I very much agree. We're very much wholehearted advocates of free school meals, and I think the mayor has done a great service for London in the work that he's done to roll out free school meals in the city, and the government has now increased the eligibility as well, which is something we welcome. I think on that we'd always push both the city and the government to go further and faster. I think we would want to see free school meals extended to secondary schools. Secondary school pupils would also benefit enormously from both, as you say, in terms of household budgets, but also in terms of supporting those young people's ability to learn and thrive in school. So, yeah.
I think, I may be wrong, but I think Tower Hamlets Council actually do fund free secondary school meals as well.
I think you're right, yeah.
Pranesh, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just also add that analyses of family policies done across Europe and the Western world show that it's not only childcare. We think of childcare as nurseries, right? But 7-year-olds need childcare, 8-year-olds need childcare. And how are you going to get to work on time if you can't drop them off somewhere? If you need to be sitting at your desk at 8:30 or clocking into your job at 8:30, then you probably need to drop your children off somewhere. So in addition to providing the nutritional needs for children who are food insecure, having a space for them to go to in the morning so their parents can get to work and make money and support themselves, both before school and after school, is important, because childcare persists until, I would argue even teenagers need childcare, right? But they're too old for childcare. They need places to go, third spaces they can go to not get into trouble. Teenagers of all backgrounds, they need something to do. So childcare across the life course is important, not only for the children, but to keep parents in labor.
Yeah, I think it's massively important for those that need it. I think coming in the kinds of lanyard-wearing classes, we can take for granted things like flexible working and so on. But actually, for those that don't have control over their work hours, who maybe have to travel long distances to get to where they're going, that that confidence that the child will have a healthy meal for them, that they will have a safe place where they can be. That makes a massive difference. We support the work of Sustain on food poverty, and just their annual report showing the progress of different boroughs in tackling it. I think, and like you say, the London-wide initiatives have been really important.
Let's focus on the impact that a declining number of children will be having on London. We're going to be moving on to Assembly Member Georgiou.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to apologise to Assembly Member Desai. It wasn't deliberate that I nicked his question, but I do agree with him. We should congratulate the coalition government and the Rishi Sunak government for the brilliant work they did in childcare costs and tackling that. I would like to ask you, Catherine, what impact is the reduction in the number of children having on primary schools in London? I know we've addressed some of it from the beginning, but just to explore it a bit further.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think education is something we would always say as a child poverty charity is something of success in London. I think we've got we have at least had a very positive story to tell. The disadvantaged gap in attainment is lower in London than it is in other parts of the country. In Inner London in 23-24, disadvantaged students were 14% less likely to gain level 3 qualifications than their peers, compared to a nearly 30% gap outside London. We know it's not a completely rosy picture. In some boroughs, that disadvantaged gap has been widening, and since 2018-19, the gap has grown by more than 5% in 6 London boroughs. But overall, London schools have done a very good job of addressing that disadvantaged gap. Our concern now is that a decline in pupil enrolment will lead to a further reduction in resources, and potentially that progress becomes more fragile and more difficult to preserve. We fear that reduced pupil numbers could lead to disadvantaged children being disproportionately represented in undersubscribed schools, which will in turn face greater challenges than schools that are full. In large part, that's down to the fact that we have per capita funding for pupils, so the pupil brings the funding to the school. So that has a potentially disadvantaged effect, because whether there's 30 kids or 15 kids in a class, the teacher costs the same. But for those schools where there are really low numbers, those resources are going to be much more stretched. There's potentially concerns about recruitment to those schools, teachers concerned about potential school closures, looking for jobs. We know there's lots of demand for teachers. They're not going to be attracted to those schools where there are falling roll numbers. Other issues that might arise might be sort of decline in parental engagement in those schools, not because parents of children in more disadvantaged communities are less engaged in their children's education, but they simply may have less time to support those children. They may be working more than one job. So combined, all those factors means that we are concerned that there'll be an impact on standards, and it'll be hard to maintain high standards of teaching, and a reduction in the opportunities that can be offered to children in those schools where numbers are lower. And for schools that do have to close, and we know that in some boroughs there have been significant numbers of school closures, that is a disrupting factor to their education. These may be children who've already experienced disruption due to the pandemic, and then a second disruption, having to move schools again potentially. We are really worried that the impact will be disproportionate on those who are most disadvantaged.
So just on that point then, because I'm not aware of where, I know we always hear of schools closing, but I'm not aware of where the threshold is in terms of school and class size that reaches to the point where actually if you drop below that level, that's when the school has to close, because it's obviously not going to be zero. I mean, is it a 50% drop off in a year? How does it work? Because from what I understand, my sort of region of North London, where schools have closed or where they are planning to close, you sometimes see a 10, 20, 30% drop off, but I haven't really seen it drop to below that. So where is the threshold? Do we know where that is?
I wouldn't be certain there's an exact threshold. I think different local authorities have approached it quite differently. I think in some areas they have sought to merge schools, others they've closed them, and in others they have managed to keep them open and managed to plan so that that hasn't had to happen. But I do think that there is, like you say, there will be a point at which it's unsustainable, certainly financially. I know, I do believe the government has sort of, through the Direct Schools grant, recognised this issue to some small extent and has provided some additional funding where there are declining school roles, but certainly not to kind of compensate for the per capita funding.
No, and
simply to manage that process, I think.
No, I think where I agree with you, I mean, there is a massive DSG problem, and I think you're finding a lot of local authorities have got massive black holes in their budgets with regard to the DSG. But one of the points you mentioned about money following pupils and disadvantaged pupils, I mean, there was another fantastic policy from the coalition government, which was the pupil premium. Now, how does that impact? We're all very excited, some of us anyway. How does that impact the, with money following the kids, you spent a lot of your answer looking at disadvantaged, addressing the points of disadvantaged children. How does the pupil premium, because obviously there is more money that follows them throughout their school careers, how does that work? And, with regard to your point in terms of disadvantaged schools, we've got areas where there are more disadvantaged pupils.
I mean, the pupil premium is also per capita, does also follow the child. So I suppose, in those more disadvantaged communities where they have historically received more pupil premium, they've had more pupils eligible. If they receive lower numbers, then that will be a proportionally even greater loss of funds to them. I mean, I do think one of the things I was going to say in response to sort of what policies do we want to sort of redress some of this, we could look at sort of channeling greater funds through there will be savings, of course, for the government. Fewer pupils means there is less money coming from central government. Could that be used through the pupil premium as a mechanism to compensate some of these schools?
Rather than closing?
Is certainly a possibility.
Okay. Thank you. No, thank you. And then my final question is, what are the potential long-term impacts of declining number of children on London's economy and public services? Now, this might be more of a Trust for London or for Bernice's point, but I don't know if you wanted to address that.
So I think there's a couple of things I would mention. That one is that there's a risk that the built environment bakes in the lack of children. That homes are built for high-income households who may not have children. Assemblymember Ahmed mentioned about where the family-sized homes are being built. London's housing panel, which Trust for London hosts, they carried out research with community groups living in new-built high-rises. And if I can quote from that report, it says, participants' experience of high-rise new build was that it lacked adequate communal and play spaces. If provided and kept clean and well maintained, people felt that communal and play space would lead to adults feeling not only less isolated, thus improving well-being, but also safer. And the comment was, they're building upwards, but not thinking about where kids will play. We've also been funding London Play, who support local campaigners to ensure new developments meet minimum requirements for providing play equipment, because it is one of the corners that sometimes developers might be interested to negotiate down, shall we say. So, yes, so if you're imagining a city without play spaces, it looks and feels very different, but then can be a deterrent for other families moving in as well. The second thing to mention is just long-term, children become workers, they become taxpayers who then pay for public services and so on. And in the context of an ageing society, that matters too. Obviously, children have much more value than being future taxpayers. But it's just worth mentioning in terms of how it can potentially skew the profile of what gets valued and what gets provided. And long-term, we end up poorer, I think.
Thank you. Bernice, was there anything you wanted to add on that point?
I think Susie touched on everything I would have said, but the one thing I would just add is that third spaces and affordable facilities for families and children are especially important for lower income families who maybe have smaller housing and then really need that public space. So, and then if facilities are too nice, people might, or not geared towards family, people might feel like, oh, it's too nice for me to bring my loud children here. So, and it's very important for free, accessible, public third spaces to be available to meet the needs of families from a variety of incomes.
And I think just on that point, I completely agree with you. And this is why we need to protect all green spaces across London to ensure that people, because as we know from the pandemic, it was mainly, people from an ethnic minority background that had fewer, less garden space and accessible green spaces. And just, sorry, Chair, if I may, on Susie, on one of the points you made about baking in this impact, you know, reducing this of, you know, I don't want to say the space that people have to raise children in. You mentioned a cost argument. Well, equally, you mentioned tower blocks, which people now have got very strong views on. You know, it goes the other way. If you bake in too many 1- and 2-bed flats, well, that limits the space that families have to grow, does it not? No, you're more than welcome to. Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Just,
Can I just...
yes, you can
Can I
come
just have
in.
one
Yeah,
point on,
yeah.
on public services, just because I think it is important. We focused on schools, but I think there is also an impact on healthcare as well being seen. I know the Royal Freeze announced that it's going to close its maternity unit because of the number of mothers having babies in Camden has fallen very significantly by almost 30% since 2019-20. And I think, again, there are potentially disproportionate impacts about who that impacts in the borough, which, you know, it's often, you know, which services at which end of the borough are serving which communities get closed. And I know that the MP, Tulip Siddiq, has you know, flagged that she's concerned that the most marginalised members of her constituency are the ones more likely to be affected by those sort of closures. And I suppose the other thing I just wanted to flag was in terms of non-statutory services that local authorities provide, so play facilities in parks, youth services and so on, that are non-statutory in nature. We know how much pressure London's councils are under and likely to be more so if threatened reformulation of the children's funding formula comes to pass. It will be those services that are most at risk and where they still exist at all, government sort of local government forced to sort of implement further cuts to those. And I think there is just a bit of a risk of it becoming a vicious cycle. If those facilities of play facilities and youth services are stripped out because we can't afford them, then they're less likely to attract families to come in there. So I think there is a bit of a concern that if we lose that infrastructure, it's very hard to put it back in place.
Thank you. I mean, I wanted to just continue on that, on those thoughts, Catherine, because I was also thinking, not just youth services, but businesses that provide services to the youth. Have you seen any indication that there might be businesses that are having real struggles at the moment because of the fact that there are less young people for them that they can serve?
I wouldn't say I had hard evidence of that, but I certainly think it's pertinent to the point about schools in their communities. You know, the school pickup time at a primary school is a whole kind of different sort of part of the local economy than say, the nighttime economy or workers coming to get their lunch. You have parents coming at pickup to kind of, you know, they are keeping some of those shops going, and they are increasing footfall in those areas. If those schools, that's the thing, they're not just providing education, they are part of their communities and part of their local economies as well. So I would definitely expect there to be an impact there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just talking anecdotally, but I've seen soft play centres close, for example, you know, that I used to go to with my children. They no longer are there anymore. In fact, pretty much nearly all the ones that I went to have gone. So I think there's some really interesting kind of patterns here in terms of how businesses are changing and focusing on different areas maybe that just, you know, just not economically viable now. And I also just wanted to touch on the issue of school closures as well. There might be different parts of inner London that are impacted differently. So, for example, in Southwark, 8 primary schools have closed down in 3 years, but also in Southwark, the new Economics Foundation revealed that 1 in 30 children in Southwark are living in temporary accommodation. So is there a correlation there between that and the school closures and different parts of inner London being impactedly, you know, different kind of scenarios of school closures?
I think that is true. There is definitely a very local effect. I know I looked at Hillingdon, and they're certainly until recently have been housing large numbers of asylum-seeking children in hotels, which have either had to accommodate in primary schools. So that's a very particular circumstance, and I think that is replicated across London. And as you say, you know, children in temporary accommodation are often, you know, living in one borough and at school in another borough. So I think there is definitely a question about whether there is a more sort of sub-regional, regional approach that could be taken that would help to bring stability to those figures. But there will be absolutely local variation, yeah.
Just before we go to Assembly Member Garrett, just to have one more quick question as well. As we were talking about the fact that families are, there are movements out of inner London, perhaps even later out of London, and those decisions that people are making about having families but not in inner London, does that mean that potentially there's also a possible brain drain, like professional people who could be moving out of London, and that could be also another economic impact? Is that something that any of you have actually thought about or even seen any data or interesting information on? It's a question for anyone, really. Is there anyone who wants to comment on that?
So I can comment on the data for the gentrified areas, if that's helpful. So in terms of the profile of who was moving in and out of those, the groups that were moving out were lower managerial, administrative and professional occupations, intermediate occupations, these are not very friendly names, but lower supervisory and technical occupations, semi-routine, and students. So it's not the bosses necessarily, but it's the sort of middle managers, it's the middle income people and the students who aren't able to afford to live in the gentrified areas. And they're often sort of in the heart of the community as well. If we're talking about the schools and who forms the PTAs and so on. We do see that in terms of a shift on who are shopping in the shops and keeping the businesses going as well.
Yeah, thank you. I've noticed that myself. Particularly, for example, teachers. That kind of profession moving out of London seems to be a trend that seems to be happening. Thank you very much. Assembly Member Garrett on policy interventions.
Thanks. We've had a sort of wide-ranging discussion on, all policy areas relating to children, I suppose. But obviously, our specific focus today is about birth rates. Suppose if I start with you, Bernice, are there... obviously, this is an international pattern. It's not London. It's not even just the UK. It's a pattern we see in all developed nations, as far as I can tell. So, are there any policy interventions that have occurred, in other countries, anywhere at all of any type, that have had any impact on what seems to be otherwise quite a well-confirmed downward trend in fertility rates?
The effect of policies is notoriously difficult to measure because it's never possible to measure a counterfactual, and there's very few experimental designs. But there is some evidence to suggest that childcare is probably the most robust kind of factor, like affordable childcare starting from birth, to that encourages people having children. And the ability to reconcile work and family across the life course is important too. So one-time cash transfers don't seem to be helpful. Childcare that's only for subsidized childcare that's only for when children are tiny is not as impactful as things that are sustained and support parents across their working lives and children across ages as well. And I guess what like in academia, we get asked all the time how well pronatalist policies work, but pronatalist policies, I'm not sure what role they should have in liberal democracies. So, but we do know that survey data still shows that most people in the UK want to have 2 children, that there isn't suddenly a disinterest in children. So in that way, we can, sleep at night knowing that we're not infringing on anyone's reproductive autonomy.
Well, you sort of made it slightly jokingly, but that was I suppose the thought at the back of my mind is there does seem to be this trend, and obviously it's predominantly driven by women's preferences, and as women become more educated, more affluent, have more choices in their lives, women appear to choose to have fewer children, and who are we to tell them that that's the wrong choice? And obviously that's potentially an undertone to this debate, which you've sort of brought to the surface. So that was really what I was asking about, is that if that is the choice that people are making, some of the policy interventions we talked about would make that those women who are choosing to have children, or for the number of children they're choosing to have, would make that an easier thing to accommodate in their lives. But there doesn't appear to be anything that reverses that, what appears to be a facet of human nature. Is that where we are?
I get media inquiries about it all the time. So I would always suggest to talk more about encouraging, supporting families and supporting young people to start their lives in the ways that they choose. But to date, UK survey data do show that people across social groups want children. Like, they have ideal numbers of children, which may be lower or maybe higher than their intended number of children. So we see young people have lower fertility intentions, but their ideals are quite robust. And currently, the current measures of fertility are fluctuating. But if you look at completed fertility among people who are old and done with childbearing, that family size has been relatively stable compared to how year-on-year fertility fluctuates. So at least in the UK, people are interested in having children. They're interested specifically in having 2 children. And I feel comfortable then participating in events that talk about supporting young people to start families, supporting young families to have the number of children they want, because we do know in survey data that people are interested in having children regardless of their educational backgrounds. And usually highly educated people start having children later because they spend longer in education and they take longer to establish their careers. So it's really a timing thing. Once you control for differences in timing, lower educated people and higher educated people, their fertility patterns are the same once you control for timing. So it doesn't seem to be a big social pattern or social gradient in interest. It's life circumstances and economic circumstances.
Okay, I feel I have to ask finally, what is the difference between preferred and intended? You seem to think that was a very important distinction, which to my mind they're synonyms, so I'm thinking I'm missing something in your analysis.
No, because you don't always get what you want, right? You don't always get what you prefer. People tend to say they prefer, or their ideal number of children, both for themselves and for the hypothetical society, is about 2 children. But young people now are saying their intended fertility is lower than 2, or a much larger proportion of young people now say they don't plan to have children or they're not sure about having children. So I may prefer to live in a mansion, but I don't intend to because I don't have the money to live in a mansion. So yeah, that would be the
Understood.
difference.
Okay, different understanding of the word intention. That's where I was going wrong. Thank you. So if I can go to Catherine and Susie then, thinking about policies, levers at the mayor in particular, I suppose, and the government as well. What levers that are at their disposal ought they to be pulling? And I suppose, bearing in mind the conversation we've just had, to what extent are we talking about, dealing with a shift that is happening versus, changing a pattern, if you like? So who would like to? Susie.
So 3 things to mention. One is build social housing. Build affordable homes that mean that people can stay, can start a family, can make a life here in London, including those who are in the essential occupations that we all depend on. I think a well-managed private rented sector makes a difference. I know the Mayor has limited powers in that area, but has been doing a certain amount of work convening and supporting boroughs' practice, for example, around enforcement, which I think can make a real difference. And just to reinforce what colleagues have been saying about family-friendly policies, so we fund the work of Women's Budget Group, which looks at the penalties women can face in terms of starting a family economically, and the Mayor has been, I think, vocal in support of that. And then groups like Pregnant and Screwed, who have just drawn attention to some of the evidence around, again, the penalties women are facing in terms of starting a family. So there are things that are within the power, if you like, of London government that could help.
Okay, Catherine.
Thank you. the first thing to say as a child poverty charity at this point in time is that the first thing we would want the government to do would be to remove policies that are increasing child poverty and that are also intended to discourage some groups of people from having children. Most obviously the 2-child limit, not that it's actually very effective in terms of that policy intention, but also the benefit cap as well, which has a very significant effect on families in London. The other thing I'd say is around the data question. This session's been really fascinating for, both in terms of the data that we do have and the data that we don't have. And I think, there's a really strong role for the GLA to be playing. I know it does a lot of work on providing data on projected school populations for local authorities, and that work, it strikes me, is only going to become more and more important. So I would just put a plug in for the work that's being done and for it to continue. There has been some polling on what people think would incentivise others to have children in the UK. So Ipsos did some polling in June this year, and it found that 42% of British adults said that more affordable housing would be most likely to lead people to have more children in the UK, and that was followed by more affordable childcare at 38%. So not to kind of reiterate sort of the conversations we've already gone over, but it does strike me that in terms of not necessarily encouraging to have people to have more children in terms of the overall fertility rate, but in terms of getting them to have them and stay in London with them, that those things are really the absolute key. And beyond that, I would really advocate London taking steps towards becoming a child-friendly city. In 2023, Cardiff became the first UK city to become officially child-friendly, receive that child-friendly status that UNICEF accredits. So I would strongly urge the Mayor to think about taking London forward towards that accreditation. And in some ways, I think London actually does really well. I think we should credit where it's due. The Transport for London's offer of free transport for under 10s on all forms of transport, and for other young people on buses, is a really strong indication that we welcome children, that they have a place in our city, and that we value them. So I think there are other things that could be done in that vein. According to London Sport, there are over 7,000 no ball game signs remain in London, mainly on social housing estates. That's exactly the opposite. That's a message to children that they don't belong, that they don't have a place in our city. So I think the Mayor's and local authorities' endorsement for that campaign and moves to kind of open up those public spaces would be very welcome again. I think, and the final thing would be, I think, again, in the kind of narrow context of this inquiry, to really look at school funding and see how some of that money, which is not going to be flowing in terms of per capita funding, where there are fewer children, can some of that be reinvested in making sure that the unintended outcome of falling school rolls is not an increase in the disadvantage gap, because that's probably my greatest concern in this space.
Okay, a lot of those. If you ask a campaigning charity on child poverty what they would like to do, you get a list like that. That's not necessarily the same list that would necessarily lead people to have more children. I don't know whether there's evidence but I guess what you're saying is that for those children that people are having, those are policies that would make those children's lives better. Is that the
I think it would make them more likely to have those children in London and stay in London with those children. I think that's clearly what that polling data was telling us, that people are telling us that they believe more affordable housing and childcare would allow them to stay in London and have their children, where their ancestors may have done for many years before them, and that may be their choice, so that they can continue to be here and contribute to our society and our economy. I think certainly we should want the young people that are doing so well and flourishing in our schools to want to stay in the city and contribute to its future success.
Okay, and then just moving specifically onto the London Plan, which obviously is one of the big levers that the London Mayor has, which is basically about the built environment and housing and so on. We did touch a bit on before. One point that you brought up, Catherine, you mentioned 4 boroughs, 2 of which I particularly noticed because they're the 2 fine boroughs of Sutton and Croydon that I'm proud to represent. As boroughs, they are great boroughs, that are boroughs where people can afford to have children, and in fact, it's not entirely by coincidence that that's where I live. current sort of new build that's happening in those boroughs largely isn't family housing. So I don't know, I appreciate not everybody every day of the week is travelling down to Sutton and Croydon and checking how the built environment's changing, but that is a thing that I do since I'm there anyway. And actually, if the picture is that these are boroughs, among others, where there's this sort of resource of family housing that people elsewhere might move into, let's say in their 30s when they think about having a family, that pattern is actually changing. So, is that something that you're aware of, and is it something you've thought about in terms of what London plan policies there might be to make sure that those outer London boroughs, not just Sutton and Croydon, but let's say particularly Sutton and Croydon, are able to preserve that sense of being, family boroughs where people move to, in midlife, if you like, with families, where there are good schools and parks and all those great things that people like. Is that something that's on your radar as a changing issue in London?
Definitely, yeah, I would definitely say so. I think we are very concerned about new housing starts not being the vast majority of one beds, a very small proportion of two beds, and hardly any are 3 or 4 beds. And that is, it is absolutely something I'd be wanting to feed into the London plan. And, I know the inclusive talent strategy is a big part of that. And I think, having people, places where people can live are absolutely essential for, ensuring that there are the people we need to work in our city. So, yeah, I would definitely endorse that.
Thanks. Susie?
Yes, to build on that, I think we all want to see a London that's a great place to live for everyone, and that includes affordable, accessible homes with access to green space, and just thinking about what's at stake in terms of mayoral policy, going back to those 53 gentrified areas. When you look at the names, they're strangely familiar to people working in housing policy, because it's places like Woodbury Down, Somerstown, Graham Park. And these are often areas which have had estates rebuilt, with the numbers of social homes going down and a lot of homes built for sale or bought by private landlords. So if you take Woodbury Down, for example, it's undergoing one of Europe's biggest single-site estate regeneration projects, with more than 2,000 homes being demolished and replaced by 5,500 new ones. Now, changes in density happen. Of the 2,000 that have been completed, you see that there's just been 275 fewer social rented homes than there were in 1999, and that the cost of private rents has soared in the area. So it's gone up from about £1,500 for an average one bed in 2021 to over £2,600. So that's, my maths isn't as good as it should be, but that's something like a 2/3 increase in rents over time. So for me, that just shows what's at stake in terms of these areas, the huge demographic changes that gentrified areas have seen. And yes, in the wonderful boroughs of Sutton and Croydon, let's make sure that planning policy is contributing to keeping London a mixed, vibrant place for families and everyone to live.
I mean, one of the challenges, of course, is that the mayor's planning targets define numbers of units. So Croydon is building its required number of units, and if in order to do that it builds lots of 1- and 2-bedroom units, then if what you would quite like is a 3-bedroom home or even a 4-bedroom home for your family, obviously that 2-bed unit is not really going to fit your needs. So presumably, I mean, there are 2 issues that have come out of that really. One is about maybe the targets need rethinking about, so that the incentive is not simply to build lots and lots of 1- and 2-bedroom units. And secondly, you brought up the point, Susie, about estate regeneration and the nature of what is left after the regeneration versus what was there before. So those are 2 policy areas you think that something should be different.
I think that's right, and the London Housing Panel has been having conversation with the housing land teams about the needs assessment. I think it's called the SHMAR, Strategic Housing.
The SHMAR, yes, the Strategic Housing Market Assessment. Yeah.
But trying to sort of have the conversation to make sure that that reflects the needs of all the different groups who make up London. Oh, my brain's gone blank. I'm so sorry.
Well, so I was just asking, so the 2 policy areas that I think you flagged up, one was about in the London plan and the incentives that drive small 1- and 2-bedroom units versus, say, 3, maybe 4-bedroom family homes. And secondly, you were talking about estate regeneration and how the before and after can end up looking like more homes, but actually quite a different set of the types of homes that are there, and what policies you think might drive better outcomes in both of those examples.
Yeah, and in that respect, I think we welcome the announcement in the comprehensive spending review of significant amounts of funding for social and affordable housing, with the emphasis on the social. And we know that the Mayor has been looking at, the affordable housing requirement as well. So we would, our stakeholders would want to see as many social rented homes, because they are the only affordable ones for low-income Londoners.
Okay, did I see you indicating to come in as well, Catherine, or you were just nodding enthusiastically with what was being said?
I think you put on something interesting about those targets, though, and I think the fact that they are just per unit is problematic, because I think, you could look at a story saying, well, there are declining numbers of children and families in London, ergo we need fewer homes for families, and that becomes self-fulfilling. And so I think, looking at those targets and making sure that they do encourage house building, which may be less profitable, I suspect, for developers, for those larger units, I think is something that we really need to kind of prioritise.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Georgie.
I indicated I wanted a question for Assembly Member Garrett. I think succinctly rounded up my views, but I think back to I think, Susie, you, and by no means this is, I just want to point something out. You mentioned Woodbury Down, and you focused on the affordable, quite right, and the reduction since the 90s. But equally Woodbury Down, because I drive past it quite often, it is all tower blocks and effectively 1 and 2 bed flats, which I think highlights, once again, there's all this gentrification and regeneration without family housing coming in. And so actually, I think, I think Catherine and Susie's comments, Bernice, and I appreciate, it's a lot to go through given the exchanges just happened. But I think, do we have more data, as someone with a demography background, on this sort of, the sorts of people, what types of housing are having more kids?
We know that the propensity to have a first birth in social housing is stable and relatively high. And historically, the propensity to have a first birth when you own your property is also high. But with more people renting, the gap between private rented people and homeowners is closing. So more people are having children in private rented accommodation, but private rented accommodation isn't stable. And most people in the UK have 2 to 3 children. So that first birth might happen in the 1 to 2 bedroom flat. You could fit a baby in a 1 to 2 bedroom flat. But as you go on, if you have 2 or 3 kids, that might push you out of housing, kind of housing.
And I think the first part of your answer, what you've told me, is effectively, because when we say social housing can mean anything. It can mean a flat, it can mean a house, it can mean a 5-bedroom house, based on tenure type, because we know lots of councils still have council housing that falls within a whole range of housing type. I think more, and I appreciate you won't have it to hand and it won't be for this meeting, but if ever you do get the chance, it would be really helpful to actually drill down, right, if the data is available, survey data or whatever it is, just to say, right, okay, this is how many people are having kids in this type of housing tenure, not whether it's social, social affordable, social rent, private rent. My question is solely focused on the literal build of a house or a property, and the sorts of people that are having kids, because I think it underlines the point that we're getting to here, which I think Catherine, the exchange between Catherine and Assemblymember Garrett, I think hits neatly on, which is, if people live in a house, as we understand it, a traditional house, are they having more kids versus someone living in a 1 or 2 bed flat? So it's just a question. I don't know what the answer is. So it'd just be interesting to know.
Yeah, I'm not sure that. Gosh, I'm trying to think of a UK survey that specifically asked.
Well, this is what I mean. I know it's very complicated.
We ask tenure, right, and we ask number of bedrooms, but we don't. I'm not sure.
Well, you can have a 3-bedroom flat.
Exactly, but
and a 3-bedroom house.
But I don't think British people like 3-bedroom flats for just in terms of social norms. It seems like there's a cultural preference for a house, even though there's lots of flats that could be quite fancy. So I'm trying to think. I'm not sure in our surveys that we usually use.
It's a very niche question. I appreciate that. So, yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't be. I feel like given there are these cultural preferences, it actually might be a good question to introduce.
I'm full of good ideas
going forward.
Thank you. Susie, I saw that you just wanted to come in.
Just to make what might be an obvious point about people's housing careers. So one of the things that the data does show is that there is suppressed households at the moment. So there are young adults still living with their parents because they can't get that first home. They can't get into the one-bedroom flat, the two-bedroom flat. And so there's something about just recognising the careers that people have of like moving into their first independent home, which may be something smaller, and then into, maybe it's a two-bed when they have their first child, and then at the point at which they are able to afford something that isn't a flat or something. That I think makes a difference. The key point being that in order to do those things need to be affordable, right?
No, and just anecdotally, I fit neatly into all your brackets that you've mentioned. I didn't want a child, and I think it goes back to your cultural point, Bernice, about being in the UK. I didn't want a child until I owned my own front door, and that's when we had our first kid in a two-bed flat. I then didn't want the second one until we had a house, so we waited for that. So I think you're completely right, and I appreciate the questions that we're asking today go all over the place because it's quite a niche area, I think. But no, I really do appreciate the response. It's been a really engaging session, so thank you all.
Thank you so much. I want to just clarify that I really like the idea of a child-friendly city, London being a child-friendly city. A child-friendly city is a friendly city to all. I can see that being an absolute need for us to be able to push for London to become. But that's my opinion, and I'm sure the Assembly members here, we will discuss that later. But the other additional question I want to say is just that we've been talking a lot about the reasons why families are moving out, or the reasons why young people are deciding not to have children, and it's all been a little bit negative, let's say. But there are also some really interesting questions here of why do families want to stay here? Because they're not going because, they want to go. They're going because of all these other additional reasons. So have any of you discussed that question? Why are families wanting to stay here in this city and to raise their families and their children?
We're just about to publish some work we've done around sort of talking to families who are at risk of homelessness and experiencing temporary accommodation. I've been talking to some support workers who've been supporting families who've moved out of London, and young people as well, single young people who are homeless who've been moved out of London. And one of the striking things they've said is how strong the draw is back to London for those people. Actually, a lot of people, even when they've been placed away, over time they'll make their way back. And a lot of that's to do with London's diversity. They feel, they can be, from lots of different communities, and they can find a place here and they can and feel comfortable here. A lot of that's to do with, there are, London is one community, but there's also lots of smaller communities as well. And I think, people are attracted to that, and they come back seeking that. So I think, I think it is that diversity, and I think that's why that age diversity is as important as any other dimension. I know our colleagues at Age UK London have done a lot of work to advocate for London being an age-friendly city and a city where older people are fully accommodated. And I think, we would definitely want to see that intergenerational strength at both ends of the spectrum. And like I said, I do think there are things London does do really well for children. I think, free transport is a really good example of that. I think, when I talk to colleagues who look at child poverty and the experience of children, say, in the northeast of England, where, bus fares are a huge pressure on families and really limit children's opportunities, our children are able to hop on a bus and go anywhere at any point, and that's something really valuable. So there's plenty to build on, and I firmly believe that London's a fantastic city for children. It's got a huge cultural offering, free museums, lots for young people to take advantage of, but they do need a roof over their head to be able to do that.
I think that's a great way to end the meeting, in terms of celebrating what we have here in London as well, and why so many families do want to make this their home. So thank you very much for a wonderful meeting. Thank you so much for all of your insights. We have now reached the end of the session. I'd like to thank our guests for attending this meeting, for all their contributions today. The committee has a few more items of business to deal with, so I would just kindly ask our guests to remain just seated just for a moment while we go through the proceedings. It won't take long. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? And can we also delegate authority to me as a chair in consultation with group lead members to agree an output arising from the discussion? Agreed. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme of the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the site visit to Dusty Knuckle Bakery on the 17th of September 2025? Thank you. And the next meeting of the committee will be held on the 13th of November 2025 at 10 o'clock in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you. Thank you.